Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Mom's birthday parties had always been performances disguised as affection, glittering evenings where people pretended the air wasn't thick with competition, secrets, and the faint scent of Chardonnay diplomacy. That night, her timeless elegance theme made the rented hall look like a suburban Versailles, white roses and glass cylinders, gold accents that reflected the light just enough to hide the exhaustion beneath everyone's smiles. I arrived 10 minutes late on purpose, because being early at my mother's parties always meant being used as decor, the dutiful daughter who sets the stage before the royal guests arrive. I walked in wearing navy, not gold, a small rebellion in silk, and every set of eyes briefly turned toward me like I'd interrupted a play mid-monologue. The bartender handed me a gin and tonic, and I could already tell from his eyes that he'd been briefed on the family hierarchy. My mother gets champagne, my brother gets whiskey, and I get the cheap citrus option because apparently I like light drinks. The music was pleasant but hollow, and the laughter from the table near the piano was that exaggerated kind that lives exactly between alcohol and insecurity. My brother Tyler waved half-heartedly, still glued to his phone, while his wife performed the kind of charm that looked exhausting even from across the room. I spotted my stepfather Doug talking to the estate attorney, an unnecessary detail that suddenly made sense about 20 minutes later. Mom took the microphone like it was a crown she'd been waiting all evening to wear. She started with pleasantries, as always, thanking the guests for their love and support, complimenting the food, pretending humility about her age. People clapped on cue, sipping champagne, smiling the way people do when they're already thinking about dessert. Then her tone shifted, subtly at first, then sharply, like a pianist pressing too hard on the final chord. "There's one more thing I'd like to share," she said, eyes sweeping the room like a spotlight. "I've made an important family decision." She smiled, that rehearsed half-smile she used when she wanted to appear merciful while cutting someone's throat with etiquette. "After thoughtful consideration, I've decided to make some updates to my estate. It's not an easy choice, but life requires clarity. Leah will no longer be part of my will." For a moment, the room exhaled all at once. Then it held its breath. Forks paused in midair, the pianist's hand hung over the keys, and I swear even the ice in my glass stopped melting. Tyler looked at me, then quickly looked away, as if guilt were contagious. Doug smoothed his tie and nodded approvingly, the way men do when they think cruelty is maturity. I took a sip, slow enough to make everyone uncomfortable, tasted the lime, and let the silence stretch until it began to shake. "It's okay," I said, voice steady, almost gentle. "It doesn't matter anymore. My future is already untouchable." The words landed like a quiet explosion, no screaming, no tears, just a phrase so calm it made everyone panic. Mom blinked, confused by my composure, like she'd rehearsed every reaction except indifference. People started whispering. One of my aunts mouthed "untouchable," as if the syllables themselves were evidence of witchcraft. I stood, glass still in hand. "Can I say something?" I asked, and without waiting for permission, took the microphone. "First, happy birthday, Mom. You look incredible. And thank you all for coming to this touching episode of Family Theater, always my favorite genre." A few nervous laughs surfaced, polite, uncertain, guilty. I smiled. For those keeping score, tonight's plot twist is that I've been publicly written out of the family's future. But don't worry. Every good story has a rewrite. Tyler coughed, probably wishing the floor would open. Doug's jaw tightened. Mom tried to smile again, but her eyes flickered. I walked over to the gift table and picked up the small brown-wrapped frame I'd brought. "I did bring you something, Mom. A reminder." I handed it to her. She unwrapped it with theatrical caution. It was a family photo, Dad still alive, me and Tyler in our school uniforms, all of us sitting on the front steps of the old house. On the back, in Dad's handwriting, was the date, the week before his heart attack. Mom froze, thumb tracing the ink. I watched the recognition ripple through her like a chill. "You remember that week," I said softly. "When you told him everything would be fair, that no one would ever feel left behind again?" A silence heavier than accusation filled the room. She tried to smile, but it faltered. "That was years ago," she said, her voice sharp but thin. Exactly, I said. So maybe it's not about inheritance, but about promises that aged worse than champagne. I raised my glass. To fairness, in whatever form it finally takes. Then I walked away, leaving her standing there holding the frame, the microphone still in her hand, surrounded by a silence she couldn't control. The pianist started playing again, soft, uncertain notes that sounded like apology. I sat back at the bar, the gin finally tasting right, and smiled at the reflection in the glass. They thought I was bluffing when I said my future was untouchable. But that was fine. They'd all find out soon enough that untouchable didn't mean lucky or rich. It meant prepared. It meant I'd already been working towards something far more permanent than their paper promises. And the best part was, none of them even knew whose name was already written at the bottom of the next contract they'd need to survive the year. The morning after the party arrived with that peculiar brightness that follows a storm, the sky pretending nothing happened while the floor still remembers the spilled drinks. And I stood in my kitchen with coffee that tasted a little like resolve and a little like memory as I replayed Mom's announcement and the way the chandelier light had made the room sparkle like a snide compliment. And I thought about how long it had taken me to stop mistaking spectacle for love. I had learned over years of small humiliations and big smiles that my mother's favorite weapon was the story she told about herself, and last night she had directed it beautifully, but stories leave shadows when the lighting is wrong. And if you learn to follow those shadows, they lead you to the props table where the real script sits with its coffee rings and quiet edits. The first breadcrumb had appeared months earlier, not as a revelation but as a chore, because Doug had asked me to drop off a stack of refinance papers at the house while Mom was at her book club, and I had found them on the dining table like a paper buffet. Mortgage statements, a draft of a revised trust, a letter from the bank hinting at a covenant that should not be ignored, and a blue folder that did not match the others, the kind of office store blue that looks cheap until you realize it. Protects the only document that matters. Inside the folder sat a tidy packet labeled Estate Updates, with sticky flags and margin notes in a handwriting that was not my mother's and certainly not mine, that confident legal cursive that makes cruelty look official. And on the last page the track change date sat there without shame. The very same afternoon Tyler had texted me from a parking lot asking if I could help him, temporarily, with payroll at his new gym because banks are slow and vendors are jerks. I had told him no, gently and completely, which is harder than it sounds because Tyler has that gift our mother adores. He can make irresponsibility look like charm. He can talk about failure like it is a quirky personality trait. And he can drink an apology into a celebration before the check arrives. He had replied with a heart and a promise, and then, apparently, walked straight into Doug's home office and explained with tragic sincerity that he just needed a small bridge, and Mom, who prides herself on being a patron saint of appearances, signed something she did not read because the humiliation of telling her friends that her son could not make payroll would be worse than the risk of rearranging inheritances to protect him from consequences he never planned to meet. I did not scream, then or later, because I have learned that anger is a loud door that slams on your fingers, while patience is a hallway that leads to every room in the house, and the hallway was long but well lit. I took photos, not like a spy but like a person who does not trust her future to memory, and I looked up the attorney's email printed at the top of the draft, and I searched my own inbox, because of course there had been a dinner invite months earlier to celebrate responsible planning, and of course Mom had copied aunts who collect inspirational quotes and cousins who treat financial gossip like sports commentary. It took an hour to build the neat little package, dates that aligned too perfectly, the refinance document that needed a debt ratio to look better on paper, the will draft that conveniently produced that ratio, the text from Tyler about bridge money, and the timestamp that welded them together like joints on a cheap fence. The party gave me the stage, but the morning gave me the audience that mattered, those relatives who believe themselves neutral while rehearsing the family legend in their heads, and I knew exactly how to talk to them because they love receipts more than righteousness. So I wrote a careful message that sounded like grace, but held steel underneath, a note that thanked everyone for celebrating Mom and asked for kindness as she navigated hard decisions, then attached a short chain of emails and a Screenshot of the draft metadata with the time and date that settled into place like a paperweight on a lie. I did not accuse anyone, because accusations are invitations to denial. I merely clarified that the estate update had been contemplated earlier than suggested, around the same hours that my brother had been juggling payroll. And I added one sentence that was as sharp as a lacquered fingernail. I would never want anyone to think Tyler's crisis forced Mom into anything she did not fully understand. I hit send and watched the message leave my outbox, a small quiet truth wrapped in politeness, and I imagined the ripple it would make as it traveled through breakfast tables and carpool lines and garden clubs. How it would arrive on phones propped against flour canisters while scones baked. How it would plant a single thought no performance could uproot. Maybe the story last night had a missing chapter. By lunch, Aunt Meredith had replied with a heart and a question mark, the international symbol for "Are we doing this today?" And by mid-afternoon a cousin wrote to say she loved everyone and hated conflict, which always means the group chat is already lava. Mom texted a single line that felt like a stage whisper, "We should talk privately," which told me the audience was murmuring and the lights were not as flattering as she remembered. I made myself another coffee, read her message twice, and thought about the gap between control and respect, how people confuse silence for consent, and how a single document with the right date can pry that confusion loose like a nail from old wood. I did not feel victorious, only steadier, because this had never been about money I could not count on. It had been about a story they expected me to act inside, a story where I play the grateful understudy while the favored son takes bows. And I had decided to stop auditioning. When I finally called Mom, my voice was soft and my words were clean, and I told her I loved her enough to tell the truth even when it clashed with the lighting. Then I listened to the paper shuffle on her desk and the long inhale she uses to buy time. And I knew that tonight's dinner would not be about reconciling feelings, it would be about explaining the difference between a stage and a contract. Before I left the house, I printed one more page for my own folder, a courtesy copy of the email I had sent, because the first rule of surviving a family like mine is simple and not glamorous. Always bring the script with you in case someone tries to rewrite the scene while you are still standing in it, and as I walked to the door I felt that strange calm again, the one that makes people whisper untouchable like it is a magic spell, when really it is just the discipline of proof. By the time evening settled over the neighborhood and the porch lights clicked on like small reliable truths, I had decided that talking would not be enough anymore, because words in my family travel fast and mutate faster, while documents move slower but land like anchors. So I opened my laptop, poured a fresh glass of water that somehow tasted more decisive than coffee, and began the kind of search that people pretend is complicated until they admit all the roads are paved and clearly labeled, when you stop asking for permission to walk them. County records were, as always, both boring and devastating, a parade of PDFs wearing the blandest fonts you can imagine, yet each line of text held a pulse if you knew where to press, and within an hour. I had mapped the last 2 years of Tyler's boutique gym fantasy, a venture that lived on motivational quotes and lenient vendors, pushed forward by charm and deferred by luck, until the math turned stubborn and started speaking in liens, notices, and a home equity line that had been tapped like it was a family enthusiasm rather than a contractual obligation. The discovery did not require genius, only patience and the willingness to let the puzzle contradict the story I had been fed at holidays, the one where my brother was finally so close, where the next month would be the month, where one more round of marketing would attract the right clients who valued foam rollers like religion. And as I traced the filings, I could almost hear the soundtrack of these explanations, hopeful tones layered over quiet panic, and I did not feel glee, only the steadying sensation that arrives when truth clicks into place and the world stops wobbling quite so dramatically. Nested among the filings was a tax lien teetering at the edge of delinquency, small enough to ignore if you believed in miracles and big enough to matter if you believed in numbers, and it attached, naturally, to equipment that had been purchased on terms that looked generous until you read the clause that did not blink. Default triggers transfer, transfer triggers acceleration. Acceleration triggers the kind of phone calls that make people suddenly quote boundaries they never respected for anyone else. I could have picked up the phone and scolded, or begged, or performed one of those Hollywood interventions where everyone speaks from the heart while the person with the problem nods and promises, and then leaves to repeat the cycle. But I am not built for sermons, and I respect rules too much to pretend they are optional, so I did the simpler thing, which was also the harder thing, because it would not look heroic and it would not feel cathartic. I formed a small limited liability company with a name that would amuse exactly one person, me, an echo of a joke Dad used to make about how in our family the only thing that compounded reliably was denial. And then, through that quiet little company, I purchased the lien along with the right to be very polite while the clock continued to tick in a voice no one could talk over. There is an elegance to lawful leverage that people with loud tempers never appreciate, and when the routine courtesy letter went out, generated by software, printed without drama, adorned with the kind of sentence that only looks gentle if you ignore the timeline, I imagine the envelope traveling through the postal system like a paper meteor aimed not at destruction, but at awakening. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who refuse to listen is to let the calendar finish the argument for you. I did not attach a threat, because threats are admissions of insecurity. I attached a schedule, which is worse for the complacent and better for the future. And when I checked the tracking number 2 days later and saw the letter had been signed for by a receptionist who probably recognized the logo the way sailors recognize a storm, I felt the first real click of control that didn't require cruelty to sustain itself. Predictably, chaos did not announce itself with sirens. It arrived as a series of polite texts from Tyler that pretended nothing was happening, then veered into a sudden request for a quick chat about something random, and finally landed on a call where his voice tried on every costume it owned: injury, confidence, outrage, nostalgia, before settling into the familiar plea that has funded a lifetime of avoidable messes. I listened, because I believe in listening the way I believe in signatures, and when he asked if I could front a little cash just to make a thing go away, I told him I could not, because I was done setting myself on fire to keep other people warm, and because "a little" is a phrase that has broken more women than gravity. He sputtered, stammered, then swore he would handle it, and I wished him luck without sarcasm, because luck is a scarce resource and wasted pity is expensive. The next message came from Mom, who typed with the energy of a queen trying to roll back sunrise, declaring that family should not hold family hostage with paperwork, a phrase that made me laugh out loud in my kitchen. Not because it was funny, but because it revealed the exact religion she worshipped: image first, feelings second, facts if absolutely necessary, and I wrote back that paperwork is simply feelings with a date and a consequence, which is why it frightens people who prefer applause to accountability. She demanded a meeting at the house, and I agreed, because there are times when you need to place the document on the table between you and let the distance do the talking. And that is what I intended to do once the deadline in the letter ripened into a decision no speech could unwind. When the day finally arrived and the conversation unfolded exactly as tedious experience predicted, accusations that I was being punitive, insinuations that Doug could fix this with a phone call, declarations that Tyler was under a lot of pressure, and a closing argument that sounded suspiciously like a rehearsal for last night's announcement, I stayed quiet long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable, then slid a neatly copied packet across the table, the letter on top, the purchase confirmation beneath, the relevant statute highlighted like a polite underline, and I said, in a voice that did not shake, that I was not here to punish anyone or to be punished by anyone. I was here to make sure the mess Tyler made did not spill into my life like it always had, and that the way to keep the gym and the house and the peace was breathtakingly simple: honor the schedule, pay the obligation, and stop pretending that love without boundaries is anything other than permission to repeat harm. The revenge, if you insist on calling it that, and maybe I do on my braver days, wasn't explosive or cinematic. It was the stillness in Mom's face when she realized I had used the very tools Doug bragged about to unclasp the grip they'd been tightening on me for years. It was the thin line of worry around Tyler's eyes when he saw that the softer sister he counted on had learned to translate feelings into filings, and it was the unmistakable shift in the room when they understood that I had not. come to beg for a place in a will, but to collect the dignity I built on my own ledger, line by line, until it could stand without shaking in any weather they chose to bring. When I met Doug for the so-called reconciliation meeting at the house, the first thing I noticed was that he had swapped his usual golf shirt for a blazer, the kind that looks expensive until you see the lint clinging to the sleeve. And he greeted me with that professional warmth he reserved for people he believed he could outtalk. The living room smelled of sandalwood candles and fresh anxiety, and Mom sat on the edge of her cream couch, her smile stretched too tight to hold much longer. The table between us was covered with what she must have thought looked like order folders arranged in neat stacks, a teapot steaming gently. The illusion of civility rehearsed to disguise the fact that every item on that table was a piece of evidence in a silent war about control, ownership, and the price of pretending a family is functional. Doug began the conversation with his usual preamble, that smooth lecture voice that never quite let anyone else in the room finish a sentence. He explained that business misunderstandings happen all the time, that paperwork can easily send the wrong signal, and that family matters should never be allowed to spill into formal territory. He used the word territory the way generals do when they've already lost the hill but need to sound dignified in retreat. Mom nodded along, eyes darting between us like a referee terrified of both players, and I could tell she still believed she could choreograph this encounter into a gentle reconciliation scene where everyone left hugging and promising to do better next time. I didn't interrupt him. I simply opened my bag and placed a single folder on top of his elaborate arrangement, a thin stack of papers bound with a navy clip. It contained copies of the filings I had quietly gathered, including the security agreement he'd co-signed when using part of Mom's house as collateral for Tyler's business loan, a document he had always described to her as routine paperwork, which in Doug's dictionary translated to something I hope no one reads until it's too late. I waited until he noticed the page with his signature, the one he had initialed next to the clause forbidding additional encumbrances on the property without written consent from all parties involved. His jaw tightened slightly, not because he was guilty in the way villains are in movies, but because men like him hate realizing that the opponent they underestimated took the time to read the fine print. Mom reached for the papers, her hands trembling just enough to betray how much she already suspected. "Leah, this isn't necessary," she said, her voice soft and maternal, but stripped of authority. "You're twisting things to make them look ugly." I looked at her, at the woman who once convinced herself that peace meant pretending not to notice the smoke, and I said quietly that truth only looks ugly when you dress it in denial. Doug cleared his throat and began to say something about how these were temporary financial adjustments, but I stopped him with a tone I had never used before, calm and firm enough to sound like someone reading terms aloud. "Doug," I said, "this covenant breach isn't theoretical. It's filed." And the bank, for once, did not lose the paperwork. He blinked at me, caught between arrogance and disbelief, and I continued, explaining that the clause he'd ignored required immediate notice to all stakeholders if the collateral was modified or cross-leveraged. "So when you borrowed against it for the gym expansion and didn't disclose the outstanding lien," I said, "you turned my mother's house into a financial minefield. And, because I now hold the lien, I'm the one the notice must go through before you move another dollar." The air in the room changed texture after that. The candle flickered. Mom whispered my name as if saying it softly could rewind the conversation to a safer time. Doug's mask slipped just enough to reveal irritation, and he asked what I wanted, the way a man asks a cop how much the ticket is. I told him I didn't want money, I wanted compliance, and that what I had already done was only step one of what the law permitted if the breach continued unresolved. I didn't raise my voice because power rarely needs volume, and for the first time since I was a child, both of them were silent in a room I occupied. After a long pause, Mom asked if I was threatening her husband. I told her no, that I was merely enforcing the rules he had written himself, and that if she found that threatening, maybe she should ask why he'd built a system that collapses under scrutiny. I could see her struggling to reconcile the man who bought her roses with the one who used her signature as currency, and I felt an ache I hadn't expected. Pity mixed with the cold satisfaction of knowing the truth was finally heavy enough to sink through her surface of denial. The next morning, a formal letter went out from my attorney to the bank, politely requesting enforcement of the covenant and confirmation of the property's current encumbrance status. I imagined Doug opening his email later that day, reading the notification from a name he didn't recognize, realizing the schedule he had used to manipulate numbers now belonged to someone who saw it as a clock. There was no satisfaction in ruining him. There was clarity in ending the performance that had ruled my family for too long. By the end of the week, Mom called again. Her voice was smaller, stripped of ceremony. She said she wished we could start over, that she missed how close we used to be. I almost laughed, because closeness in our family had always been proximity to whatever lie made the night smoother. Instead, I told her that I wasn't closing doors, I was simply locking the ones that kept leading to fires. That night I stood on my balcony and looked over the city, the lights blinking like patient witnesses. For the first time, I understood that revenge wasn't a scream or a scandal. It was a quiet form of justice, written in the same language they used to take things from me. I didn't need their inheritance or their apology anymore, because what I had built couldn't be erased, amended, or cut out of any will. It existed in signatures, in laws, in timing, in every small act of self-respect I'd been told was overreaction. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the light, I realized that the game had ended the moment I stopped trying to win their approval and started reading the rules they assumed I'd never learn. The final turn did not arrive with fireworks or shouted apologies or some courtroom flourish they like to dramatize on television. It arrived as an afternoon that smelled like rain-soaked pavement and printer ink. And I sat at my kitchen table with the window cracked open just enough to hear the distant hiss of traffic while I laid out the documents that, taken together, formed the architecture of the life I had been quietly building in the background for years. A life that did not depend on anyone's mood or mercy, because it had been assembled from slow decisions that looked boring on the outside and felt like oxygen on the inside. I had learned, somewhere between Dad's handwriting on old photos and the first condescending loan officer who called me young lady while explaining compound interest like it was mythology, that safety is unglamorous and deeply addictive. So I had fed that habit with index funds that never bragged, with a dull little trust formed long before Doug learned how to spell mine, with contracts that ran on autopilot and answered questions before I had to, and with a ledger of favors I declined even when it would have made holidays easier. Because saying yes to chaos is the most expensive kind of generosity a woman can practice. I invited Mom to meet me at a coffee shop with mismatched chairs, the kind of place where people read without pretending to be seen, and when she arrived wearing sunglasses on a cloudy day I knew she had been crying, though she would never grant me the intimacy of admitting it. She ordered tea she would not drink, sat with that straight-backed posture she thinks sells dignity, and waited for me to blink first, while I opened a folder and slid a single page across the table. A document written in the plain language of property law that promised, in words even she could not romanticize, a lifetime right to remain in her house without fear of displacement. So long as 3 conditions were respected that were so modest they almost sounded silly: no further encumbrances without my written consent, prompt payment of all obligations attached to the property, and a strict firewall between her signature and any of Doug's business adventures, whether labeled temporary or strategic or the kind of emergency that always seems to happen on the eve of a gala. She stared at the page as if it were a letter from a former self, then lifted her eyes to mine and asked whether this was punishment dressed as kindness, and I told her it was mercy that finally learned how to read. She wanted to negotiate details she did not understand, and she wanted to talk about family and legacy and what people would think, and she wanted to know whether there was a way to unwind what had already been set in motion without anyone looking foolish. And I said that dignity is not the same thing as being admired, and that we could still have dinners and birthdays and even yard sales if that made her feel better, but the era of signing things in a hurry because someone's voice got loud was over, and the era of me apologizing for being prepared was buried next to the version of me who used to ask permission to breathe. The pen in her hand hovered like a superstition, then touched down with a tremble that told me she understood something more permanent than agreement had happened in that moment, not a victory for me or a defeat for her. but a transfer of narrative custody from people who love the sound of their own certainty to a woman who found out she could live with doubt as long as the numbers added up. Tyler called that evening with a plan that smelled like aftershave and panic, promising that a few creative moves would stabilize the gym, insisting that if I released the pressure just this once he could orchestrate a turnaround. And I told him that orchestras need sheet music and deadlines, and that I had already given him both, and that the only thing I would release was the expectation that he would suddenly become the man he pretended to be in group photos, which made him say that I had always enjoyed making him feel small, which was the precise moment I realized he had never understood the difference between accountability and humiliation, because no one had ever asked him to learn it. Doug did not call at all, but I received, through counsel, a noticeably polite inquiry about possible refinance paths under the covenant I had asked the bank to enforce, and the reply that went back was a masterpiece of civility. A full paragraph of yes and a full page of how, with dates that squared the circle between their optimism and a calendar that had run out of patience, and I felt a steadiness settle inside me that I had not known since childhood. The steadiness of a house where the grown-ups closed the door and let the storm beat against the siding without inviting it in for dinner. On a quiet Sunday, I walked the block where Dad used to time our bicycle laps, and I thought about the night at the party when I told a room full of spectators that my future was untouchable. And I wondered whether I had told the truth or merely cast a spell I was willing to work for, because the documents on my table could be stolen in a fire, the market could misbehave for a season, and people I love could still make decisions that pull at the seams of what I have sown, yet there was something in the way the air felt as I turned the corner that convinced me untouchable does not mean invincible. It means built in layers thick enough that one bad evening cannot tear through all of them at once. I thought also, though I will not say this to anyone who wants a hero or a villain, about the chronology of everything that followed the will announcement. About the blue folder left on the dining table and the ease with which I found names and dates that lined up like runway lights, and I wondered whether I had stumbled into those alignments by luck or whether, long before the chandelier speech, I had been nudging dominoes with a fingertip so gentle no one noticed until the fourth or fifth tile fell in exactly the direction I needed. A thought that warmed me and chilled me in equal measure because it asked me to admit something I am not sure I want on the record, namely that I might have become the kind of strategist I used to resent. When the final papers were filed and the calendar settled into a rhythm that hummed instead of screamed, I mailed Mom a framed copy of that photo again, this time with a new note tucked behind the cardboard, not a sermon or a scorecard. Just a sentence in my own handwriting that said we are capable of doing better when we stop insisting the mirror is wrong, and I chose a simple frame she could place on a shelf without turning it into a speech prop. I do not know whether she will ever forgive me for taking the matchbook away, or whether she will rewrite history to make herself the savior of her own story, and I do not know whether Tyler will learn how to count without counting on someone, or whether Doug will retire into a version of himself that understands the word boundary without adding a smirk, and I suppose that is the point, because certainty is the most seductive lie in families like mine, and tonight I am done chasing it. I know only that revenge, the way I practice it now, tastes less like triumph and more like clean water, and that if anyone asks me, years from now, whether I set the whole thing in motion or merely stepped out of the way while gravity finished the argument, I will smile, take a slow sip of whatever I am holding, and say that my future is untouchable because I stopped waiting for their permission to close the door.